welcome to the fourth annual Human Rights Lecture and Conversation. I'm William Saunders. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology and director of its program in human rights. Part of that program includes a Master of Arts in Human Rights, and a number of my students are here. And I would just say to any of you that are postgraduate students, want to get a graduate degree in human rights and get to have some interaction with folks like Sam Brownback and Chen Guangcheng, I invite you to apply for the program. Now, the IHE itself, the Institute for Human Ecology, draws on the Catholic intellectual tradition. Its mission is to educate students, sponsor multidisciplinary and social science research, advise church leadership and policymakers, and organize symposia, conferences, and lectures for the Academy and the public square. I would just mention that next Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the Happel Room in Caldwell Hall, we're having another event to which you're invited, which is a book launch for Dr. Angela Knobel's new book, Aquinas and the Infused Moral Virtues. She will give a little bit of a talk, and there'll be two respondents, William Madison from Notre Dame and David Elliott from Catholic University. As I mentioned, this is our fourth lecture. The previous ones, the first one was with Robert George, the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the director of the Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton. The second one was Chen Guangcheng, who's a distinguished visiting fellow here at Catholic University and is the famous barefoot lawyer from China. And then last year, virtually, we had our third lecture, which was a conversation with three members of the U.S. Commission on Unalienable Rights. I spoke with those commissioners about the report that was issued last summer that looked at the rights tradition in the United States and the human rights tradition internationally in order to advise the Secretary and President about how human rights should be integrated in U.S. foreign policy. And I would urge any of you that have a chance to read it. It's quite a good report. We're going to study it in my class next semester. So that brings us to tonight's lecture, which our lecturer is Ambassador Sam Brownback. I'll tell you a little more about him in a second. I'll just tell you the format tonight is he'll give some remarks, and then he and I will engage in a conversation here on the stage. I'll ask him some follow-up questions and raise some issues in international religious liberty. And during that, both during his presentation and during our conversation, if you think of questions, there are going to be cards and pens handed out. I don't know if they're in every seat. Where's John Henry? Where are they in every seat? Are we handing them out? Excuse me? Oh, okay. So if you didn't get one, you can get one at check-in and just write a question. We'll go through those. And then when we finish that, there is a reception, so all the students will have dinner tonight. Human rights, people use the term differently. I use it to refer to the modern human rights project which grew out of the Second World War. We're all too young to have lived through the Second World War, and I fear, though, that many of us are too young to have really been properly educated in what a devastating event it was. It was a true world war that devastated not just Europe as the First World War had, but Asia as well. The numbers of people killed are hard to grasp, but estimates are around 80 million. What's even more startling is that 50 million of those were innocent, non-combatants. They weren't soldiers, they weren't sailors, they weren't airmen or women or whatever. They weren't submariners. They were innocent people, 50 million. That was devastating, and it, of course, wrecked the world's economy. So the nations of the world formed the United Nations in order to avoid ever having a third world war, now with the threat of nuclear weapons, which could destroy the planet. And they decided to do a number of things and cooperate in various ways, but one of the things they said they wanted to do was to protect basic human rights, because what had happened in the Second World War was so horrific. And you know of the Holocaust, you know of the concentration camps, the experiments that were done on innocent people, the bombing of civilians. They never wanted that to happen again. And so in 1948, they issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and its point was to put before the world, these are the basic human rights that the world agrees through the United Nations we will respect. And in that document, Article 18 recognizes and guarantees freedom of religion. That was a declaration. There was a treaty to implement it. There are many treaties, but one of them is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it also, in its Article 18, recognizes the fundamental right to religious freedom. And for the Catholics here, which probably most of us are, you'll hear echoes of Dignitatis Humanae in Article 18. No one shall be subject to coercion. Everyone has freedom to manifest their religion in practice, not just in a closed church, but in practice, in observance, in public and in private. In private, yes, but in public also, with others. It's not an individualized right just for you to go into a prayer closet. It guarantees a robust religious liberty. I won't go through all that. If you have to take my class or take the one that I'm happy to announce, actually, this is a good moment, that Ambassador Brownback is going to teach a class in international religious liberty at the Columbus School of Law in the spring. Now, so there are these internationally recognized rights to religious liberty, but it wasn't in U.S. law until 1998 when the International Religious Freedom Act was passed. And the International Religious Freedom Act required the U.S. to take into account religious freedom in its foreign policy. Again, you know, I'm a lot older than most of you. I remember pre-1998, and the U.S. took a lot of things into account in its foreign policy. It never paid any attention to religious liberty issues. After the Religious Freedom Act, it's required by law to do so. That act does a number of things, such as an advisor on religious freedom to the National Security Council, and it created an independent commission called the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. But particularly relevant for us tonight, it established the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom within the Department of State. Ambassador Brownback is the most recent ambassador. He was the Ambassador for International Religious Freedom from February of 2018 to January of 2021. Prior to that, many of you probably know he was governor of Kansas. Prior to that, he represented Kansas in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. I first met him many years ago. He was taking a leadership role even then on international religious liberty, and we worked together against the persecution, murder, and slavery that was happening in Sudan. And he was a great leader. And he was one of the key sponsors of the International Religious Freedom Act. So prior to his public service, Ambassador Brownback practiced law and taught at Kansas State University. He got his BS from Kansas State University and a JD from the University of Kansas. He's currently co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Summit and a senior fellow with Open Doors, and he and his wife have 5 children and 6 grandchildren. Please welcome Ambassador Brownback.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that very much. And we're expecting our 7th grandchild On Thursday, I think, is the day that the inducement's going to take place, and I'm all excited about it. You can never have too many grandchildren. There's just not an upper number on grandchildren. Children, a lot of people kind of go, oh, yeah, well, wait a minute, I get tired at this point or that. But grandchildren, there's never an upper limit on it. Thank you for being here tonight, Bill. Thank you for your friendship, for your work, for your heart, for this field, for years and years. In many different capacities, and you've done a great job of it, and it's wonderful that you do that. I want to recruit you tonight. I've got comments I'm going to make, but I want to tell you at the end what I'm after, and I'm after you. I want you to get thoroughly engaged in this field. I want you to pick a particular area that you get engaged. I want you to be passionate about it. I know you probably wouldn't be here on an evening at a university and not getting any credit if you weren't passionate about it in the first place. But I want to engage you. I hope to give you some ideas of places that you can engage in because the world needs you. The world needs your activation in this area. So that's what I'm after, and I'll just warn you ahead of time. And if you don't want to participate in that, you can walk out now. I'm also happy, this is a complete sidebar, but I got to mention it. The Chiefs beat Washington in the football over the weekend. We're back. We've been kind of playing down here, but Mahomes had nearly 400 yards. We're back. So that was all kind of a rub in your face in it. I apologize, but it's one of the things we have, so I'm partial to it. So Bill talked about the outset of this, and the religious freedom is such an established human right. There's not a question about it in the world for a basic human right, okay? Let me just, Article 18, Bill cited to it, 1948. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's after World War II. The world's gone to war. It's a horrible situation. They gather together initially a number of theologians and philosophers to come up with the idea, what are the basic human rights? And Article 18, then, one of them is religious freedom. And let me just read it to you. It's very simple, direct, and clear. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in a community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Pretty clear, right? Agreed to by 192 member states of the UN. All have signed an agreement with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and that's a real clear statement. As a lawyer, I look at that, and when I used to try cases, when you could get something that's spot on point, you think, I got this case won. This is spot on. Okay. We go to the United States. We kind of started a lot of this, although I had the Mongolian ambassador tell me that Genghis Khan started religious freedom. And I said, really? Explain this one to me. He said, oh, there's a book on it. I said, okay, send me the book. And he did. There actually was. And he claimed that Thomas Jefferson got the idea from a French article he read that was written about Genghis Khan allowing people to freely practice their faith once he conquered and knocked the crap out of them, that they could practice their faith freely, and that's where Thomas Jefferson got the idea. Go get the book if you want to. But I don't know, Bill, do you cover that one in your class, the Genghis Khan origination of religious freedom? Anyway, Mongolians claim that. I'm not so sure. But anyway, the First Amendment, Thomas Jefferson, religious freedom, established here, state of Virginia. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. First Amendment, first sentence. Pretty significant, right? Pretty clear, too, right? Can't establish a state-owned church, state-run church, nor can you prohibit anybody's free exercise thereof. Pretty clear, pretty much on point. So why is such a recognized human right under such attack in the world today? So clear words, agreed to by everybody. Philosophers agreed to it, set it up. And yet 80% of the world's population lives in countries where there's substantial religious persecution, substantial limitations on religious freedom. 80% of the world's population. So why? Well, let me give you the top 8 reasons. I guess if this were a Jeopardy or a game show, we would say, give me your answers, and let me give you what the pollsters say. This is Thomas K. Johnson, senior theologian for World Evangelical Alliance. Here are his top 8 reasons why there's so much religious persecution in the world today. Islamic oppression tries to bring the country under Islamic control through violent or nonviolent actions. Religious nationalism tries to conquer the nation for one's religion. This is often Hindu or Buddhist, but sometimes Christian or Jewish. Ethnic antagonism, sometimes very long-term conflicts among ethnic groups, often with a religious component to it. Denominational protectionism tries to maintain one Christian denomination as the only legitimate expression of Christianity in the country. Communism and post-communist oppression attempts to control religions through a system of registrations and oversights, and I would say the Chinese Communist Party is even doing a lot more than that today. Secular intolerance tries to eradicate religion from the public domain or impose an atheistic form of secularism. Dictatorial paranoia, we're just trying to keep power around here. Organized corruption and crime, trying to create a climate of impunity and corruption as a means for self-enrichment. And when he presented these, and I was at the meeting he presented these, I thought, that's a pretty good, I wouldn't say it's all-inclusive, but that's a pretty good grasp of it, that the reasons for it. But I thought, well, wait a minute. This is such a clearly established human right. We believe in the United States this is a right derived from God, that our rights become from God. We've enshrined them in our Constitution that stood the test of time. But if this is such a well-established right, why are we having so much trouble? These are the answers. Okay, who's pushing back on the other side to establish then and to say, no, wait a minute, you can't do that because that's religious persecution. Who's standing to push back against this? The West? Yes, to some degree, but is also interested in many topics and also has really a lot of secular penetration pushing that, well, we don't know that we like religion in the public square in the first place. China? No, we got a communist problem there. Russia? No, we got a dictatorial problem there. The Islamic countries? No, we've got a set idea of our theology, and we think this should govern in this place. The developing world? Yes and no. Some countries, yes. Other places, not so much. So you've got this kind of a bit of a hodgepodge, and something that the West should be clearly standing up and fighting for. Until recently, we've not even really considered it an issue that we're of discussion. Until we really passed the Religious Freedom Act, it was one. This is when I was in Congress. You'd go and you'd talk to diplomats about, oh, what about these guys that are locked up in jail here for simply practicing their faith? And they'd say, oh, yeah, they probably shouldn't be here. This is, they're just getting in trouble here, and it'd be probably better off if they weren't here. And you're going, well, that's not any sort of answer. They've got a right to religious freedom. They've got a right to practice their faith. So, yeah, but they're asking for trouble. They're asking for their religious freedom. They're not asking for trouble. They have a heart that's driving them to do this. Well, that's changed now, where you've got more of the West engaged in it, but still not enough. Let me suggest to you, and here's where I'm getting to you now, that we have the starts now of a global grassroots movement to stand up and to fight for religious freedom. And this is the good news. It started. We did 2 ministerials while I was ambassador. Secretary Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State at that time. We did 2 ministerials where Secretary of State called together foreign ministers from around the world, and the topic was religious freedom. And the reason we did that is because you could just see the centrality of this issue. If you could get this fundamental human right established, many other human rights could blossom out of it. If you could get a grassroots movement going, I told you 80% of the world's population is in a country that has heavy persecution. You also have 80% of the world that moves by faith, that they themselves are people that they organize their lives around a set of faith principles. So you've got an enormous possibility for a grassroots movement if you can get it going. And that one, if you could get a human rights movement going for religious freedom, would help your right to religious to freedom of assembly, to help your right to freedom of speech, would help your right to a number of other things. If you could get this one to really move, because you got so many people that are vested in this area and that can populate such a movement. And now with the globalization that's taken place, even within religion, the globalization, every faith is persecuted somewhere. No faith is immune from it. So you can go anywhere in the world and there'll be a majority faith that may be more dominant than others, but you'll have a number of other faiths that are now there that people have moved in from somewhere else, or they traveled somewhere else and they said, I like this idea, I'd rather pursue this one. And so then you get this clash that takes place in those nations. But every faith, no matter what faith it is persecuted somewhere. This is somewhat of a sidebar, but not much. In the Middle East in particular, I would run into people that are like a modern Apostle Paul. They've seen this man in white. They've seen him at night come into their room. He speaks to them, and they change. It's like Paul on the road to Damascus. I talked to the guy from Saudi Arabia who became a follower of Jesus. And at the end of that, of course, he got persecuted a lot for it and everything. And at the end of the meeting, I said, why did you do this? Why did you start following Jesus and away from your original faith? And he said, well, one night, it was a very devout man in his own faith. One night, he sees this man in white in his room, and he thinks it's Joseph. Joseph is very perfect looking in his religious tradition and beliefs. So he thinks it's Joseph, and the man says to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The light. Follow me. And can you imagine if that happens to you? It'd kind of rock your world a little bit. He's kind of, what do I do with that? He starts to look for a church. So no churches in Saudi Arabia, the only country in the world that there's not a single church. He goes to Kuwait. He goes into a church there, and he sees a picture of Jesus, and he says, that's him. That's the guy. That's the guy I saw. This is what he said to me. And here the story gets a little funny, actually. It was a Catholic church he went to in Kuwait, and he goes to the priest and he said, I want to join. I want to follow this guy. And the guy says, yeah, we don't do that here. Go talk to the Baptists down the street here. Because. So I thought that was kind of funny. But he did. He joined, became a follower of Jesus. Then he goes back to Saudi Arabia, and then life gets really tough for him. Then he starts getting questioned and beat on by his family. Then the authorities arrest him for 6 months. Then the authorities try to get his family to kill him. And he gets enough notoriety that he's known that they don't kill him. But I asked him, why didn't you just leave Saudi Arabia? And he said, well, who would speak to the Saudi people then about what I've seen? Doesn't that sound like Paul? Doesn't that sound like the exact experience that he had? And people, this happening to all over the world. And they have a right to do this. By our own agreement on human rights, they have a right to do this. But they still get heavily, heavily persecuted. Either we will have religious freedom for everyone, or we will have increasing clash of civilizations taking place. You're going to see Samuel Huntington's thesis come more true. You're either going to have religious freedom for everybody, everywhere, all the time, or you're going to have a clash of civilizations as the globalization in religion happens, and you get more and more of these conflicts, and you get more and more of this integration, and you're either going to protect that right, or you're going to have a lot more killings and fightings. And I'm afraid that right now the trajectory the world is on is a lot more killings and fightings. Most recent genocides of the last 50 years have been of a religious minority. Genocides generally happen to a religious minority, and frankly, I believe we're setting up for one in Afghanistan now. If the religious minorities aren't capable of getting out of that country, I believe you will see a genocide there like you did in northern Iraq when U.S. forces pulled back and the Yazidis and the Christians got killed in a genocide in northern Iraq. You're seeing it today as declared of the Uyghur Muslims in western China, as declared by Secretary Pompeo. You're seeing it of the Rohingya Muslims in a Buddhist country in Myanmar. I mentioned the Yazidis Christians. Most recently, President Biden declared the Armenian genocide in the early 19-teens as a genocide. These were Christians in the declining days of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the granddaddy of them all, and certainly in modern times, is the Jewish Holocaust by the Nazis. And you see places boiling today. As I mentioned, Afghanistan, Nigeria, India, and as I mentioned in Afghanistan, you could see it of the Hazari Shia Muslims taking place at genocide. What to do? Several things. Number one, religious communities need to stand up together and be active and heard. This grassroots movement needs to be powered by the religious communities. It needs to be put forward and pushed, and it needs to be collectively the religious communities. It can't be just, okay, the Christians will do this, Muslims will do this, we'll do that. It needs to be all the faith communities coming together and standing up for each other's religious freedom. We're much more powerful when we all stand together. And we don't discuss theology when we come together like this. This isn't about theology, it's about a common human right. We're starting to see some of this take place in religious freedom roundtables being stood up around the world, some 30 of which of various religious communities are being set up in various countries around the world. We need them everywhere. Number two, Western governments and the developing world need to push together for this to happen, for religious freedom. We need countries to stand up for religious freedom. Well, as ambassador, we started an International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. There's 30-plus countries in it. It's becoming more and more active. And we need to stand up for this human right. And the thing I noticed and observed was that we're used to building economic treaties. We know how to build an economic alliance. We're used to building defense treaties and defense alliances. We know how to build those. We don't know really how to build a human rights alliance. How do you put together countries on a human right? And this one's starting to take place, but it's got to get much more robust. We need to gather together. As I mentioned, we did 2 ministerials. This last summer, we did the International Religious Freedom Summit 2021 in Washington, D.C. We had 1,200 registrants from around the world. All faiths were represented. People got along. It was an amazing event, and it was one of great respect. The religions have to start respecting each other and even caring and loving for each other, even if we don't agree on theology. We need to respect and honor, and my faith calls us to love one another. We've got to get away from this notion of just tolerance. We've got this idea somehow that we're just going to tolerate somebody else that's different. No, we've got to respect them. We've got to love them. That's the standard we need to pursue. Number 4, we need grassroots activism. We need people speaking out and drawing attention. September 25th this year in Washington, D.C., was the first ever here March for the Martyrs, Catholic group that stood up, that did a march for martyrs. We need that public visibility from the grassroots. Number 5, we need political activism, particularly in the West. I think we need something like a national committee for religious freedom in the United States to stand up for the grassroots, stand up for the fight for religious freedom here in this country. Any ground that's lost on religious freedom in the United States will be magnified around the world. This is the primary country to stand up for religious freedom. If ground is lost here, it will magnify around the world of increasing religious persecution. If we don't stand up for it here, it's got to be fought for here. My conclusion is that this is a fundamental fight of our era. We either will win it and we'll have a lot more peace, or we will lose it and we'll have a lot more killing that will take place. And you can just sit down and you don't have to do anything. That's your right in this country to not do anything. I don't think you came here tonight to do nothing. I was in Taiwan we were hosting a regional religious freedom summit. The Taiwanese, a number of us were there. And the thought really hit me that what I am doing there is I'm a tiny part, I'm a very small part of God's hands and his feet to address a problem that's on his heart. He's hearing the prayers of these people that are persecuted. There's more Christian persecution now taking place than any time in the history of Christendom. But it's not just Christians, it's everybody. And God's hearing these prayers. But then he works through us. I get to be a part of the hands and the feet, and you do too. And that's what I think we're being called to do. And then finally, I want you to go work with the persecuted. I want you to pick a faith community, anybody, any group, anywhere. I want you to go work with them. I remember being in the Rohingya refugee camps outside of Cox's Bazar, and here's a Muslim community that's been kicked out by a dominantly Buddhist governing group, and brutally so. I interviewed a mother who watched her daughter get raped, and she's just wailing in tears as she's telling this. And then they killed her. And they stuck a bayonet in her vagina and brutally killed her in front of her mother. And how can somebody do that to another person? And yet it goes on in our world today, and that's just one. I could tell you a bunch of stories, equally as graphic. And that's going on. Go work with the Rohingya, or go work with the Pakistani Christian brick kiln workers, or the Indian Dalit converts, or with China Aid out of Midland, Texas, that's resettling Christians and Uyghurs and others, or the Afghanistan Resettlement. We've got a huge effort going on now to resettle Afghan religious minorities. The Nicaraguan church, the Cuban church that's persecuted, the Saudi underground church, the Algerian, the Vietnamese Hmong. There's any number of communities. There's no shortage of targets. There's a shortage of laborers. And we in the West have a real responsibility, and you can change the direction of things, even just whatever small things each of us can do. You can change the direction. You got to engage, and you'll be rewarded for it. I'll end on this note. A mentor of mine that recently passed away, he once told me not that long ago, if you want to get to the top of the mountain, go work in the bottom of the valley. And I said, well, where's that in Scripture? And he said, well, the mountains will be brought down, the valleys will be brought even. And he said it was also his experience. He did a prison ministry program and started getting some real help and going for these guys that were in prison. And they were changing their lives. It was really impressive what was happening. He started getting all these calls from corporate vice presidents saying, hey, we'd like to help out. We'd like to see. And he was kind of puzzled by this. And then what he realized is these guys were in corporate boardrooms and making a lot of money, but they didn't feel like their lives were meaning much. I mean, they were getting rich. The company was doing well. But my soul's not growing. I want to do something to help people. And they found him working in the bottom of the valley. Top of the mountain, comes to the bottom of the valley. And it made me laugh then. It wasn't, after he told me that story, it wasn't 2 weeks later. I was in the Rohingya refugee camps over there as the ambassador. And I get called by the Vice President of the United States saying, where are you in the world? Well, I just want to encourage you on your work. Top of the mountain coming to the bottom of the valley. And that's what you'll find when you go to one of these places to help out. Top of the mountain's going to come to you. And isn't that just the way God works? It's always the least that impact on the most. It's a beautiful thing about the faith journey. It's really almost 180 degrees counterintuitive to the way the world is designed, we think as humans, the world is designed. The world wants you to be proud and do this, and God said, be humble. We want to be, loud. It says be quiet and be still. And just go work in the bottom of the valley, and you'll be greatly, richly rewarded. God bless you all.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ambassador. I want to ask you a couple of questions. How does a country like the United States, how do you make religious liberty issues part of the foreign policy? I mean, what are some of the specific things that you as ambassador did? Like, for instance, I know there's an annual report and that kind of thing. Because some of these folks might know, it's one thing to say we got to take it into account. How are we trying to do that?
You've got the official mechanisms that you mentioned. You do an annual report. U.S. State Department puts out religious freedom report on every country in the world except the United States. And that's really one of the gold standards for what's going on in religious freedom. You've got, the U.S. Commission on religious freedom, that International Religious Freedom, USCIRF, that's there and does the official things. But I think the bigger piece of it, frankly, is to find the opportunistic places to get engaged. And Afghanistan's a great one right now. Who is standing up and fighting for the religious minorities in Afghanistan? You hear some about persecution of women in Afghanistan, and you should hear a lot. But these religious minorities, they're going to get wiped out. And we should be inserting ourselves into the Afghan discussion right now with this point, because this will happen. If you're a Christian convert in Afghanistan, your life and your family is in peril if you haven't already had a family member killed. If you're a Mahdi Muslim in Afghanistan, you're in hiding right now. If you're a Sikh, you better be in deep hiding right now. They just bombed the Shia mosque of the Hazaris last week, and I wouldn't doubt you could see a genocide of the Hazaris taking place in Afghanistan.
So what can the U.S. do? What would you do if you could do whatever you can in Afghanistan?
Well, right now, I would, and I've just signed a letter on this along with 50, 60 other groups calling for a P2 designation of religious minorities coming out of Afghanistan to allow them a direct refugee access into the United States. This is like a Lautenberg amendment for religious minorities, and we've capped it. We've suggested 4,000 per year to allow into the United States. And then also, we should be using our official connection. State Department should be pushing other countries to take religious minorities as well. Brazilians, I think, would do it. I think there are other countries that would take religious minorities. Europeans should. We're not talking a large number here, but we are talking deadly consequences if they're not allowed out. And I thought it was a disastrous move of us pulling our military out of Afghanistan. Just absolutely. I thought it was one of the worst things we've done as a country in the last couple of decades, honestly, to what we have done, and then left our allies on the field. This is not the way we operate. We don't leave our friends and allies on the field and our own on the field.
How much of what you do is responding to a crisis like Afghanistan as opposed to trying to grow religious freedom in a place that is not in crisis?
Yeah, you do. In the office that I was in, you do a lot of trying to grow places that aren't in crisis. I'm just, usually you try to take, you only get the terrain that you're dealt with. You don't know what issues you're going to be dealt with once you're in office, so you got to play the terrain in that way. But if you can grow a place, like Uzbekistan has really been changing from this heavy Soviet police state model. Sudan represents a real opportunity where you left an Islamic regime, but you're not sure what you're going to get coming out the other side. Well, this is a time you really engage them, because did any of you ever watch the Olympics curling? Anybody watch curling? It's the only Olympic sport that I know of you can play while smoking. And so, that's just, you think about, I don't know if, I don't smoke, but I mean, you think about how many Olympic sports can you do while smoking? But the guys, right as the puck, the stone is going up to hit the others, they're brushing feverishly to try to get the stone to move their way. Well, this is the time we need to be brushing feverishly with Sudan to try to get the thing to move our way as much as we can. I hope I didn't insult any curling.
I don't
Does anybody
think,
here curling?
as Catholic,
curling?
you have the #1 curling team in the country. No. So I think there's a lot of different questions I want to ask you, but let's talk about the summit this summer. As you mentioned, it was kind of an unofficial ministerial, right? I mean, you did,
Civil society-led minister of sorts, kind of.
I mean, because there's people from all over. These 2 ministerials you did when you were the ambassador were the first the U.S. has done, and we had foreign ministers from other countries coming from all around the world. So there was a tremendous demand, and for those of you that weren't able to go or whatever, there was such a demand that he had to put tents outside. It spilled out of the State Department, actually, and it was tremendously successful. And then this summer we had an unofficial or civil society-led summit.
That was the largest human rights event ever done by State Department, was that second ministerial. And it goes to my point about the grassroots nature of this movement. There is energy here that you can tap into. You got to be willing to do it.
Yeah, and it's, as you pointed out, it's not for any one religious group. It's not Christians only caring about Christians. But it is counting on Christians to talk about where they're being persecuted, and Muslims to talk about where they're being persecuted, Buddhists talk about where they're being persecuted. And that's the power, wouldn't you say, of the summit, is you bring all these voices from around the world and they tell their story. I was sitting in the audience and listening to people tell their story is deeply moving and very powerful.
Oh, it is. And that's the power of the story. I mean, we all know that people move more by emotion than they do by reason. And the stories are powerful of what's happened to so many people around the world of every different faith. And you kind of just sit there and you listen to them and you're going, why isn't somebody doing something about this? Doesn't that make your blood boil that this is happening? And it does in the audience. And I just think, though, our lack of organization and pushing, particularly out of the West, to do this has let this basic human right be just stomped on in most of the world. And stomped on hard, where people are killed for peacefully practicing, for peacefully being some other faith than the dominant faith. They're just being killed, brutally many times. The Yazidis, how they were treated in northern Iraq, just horrible story. They were treated worse than vermin. It's horrible.
You know, the 2 countries I want to spend a couple of minutes on. One's China, I'll come back to that. The other one is Sudan, because as I mentioned, one of the first times I met you is when working on Sudan, and there was incredible persecution and genocide and slavery. It was unbelievable. And you were one of the leaders along, I think, with Congressman Frank Wolf, responding to that situation. But it's interesting to look at because that was 20 years ago, and but this goes to your point about what people can do. People got interested, some few people. They made connections with other people who did a little bit. Somebody did something. And at one point, somebody also was in church with George W. Bush at his church. And the people at his church saw this issue. And when he became president, the Sudan Peace Act was passed as a result of his interest in putting Senator Danforth as a Sudan envoy. And anyway, this leads, believe it or not, I mean, I told my nephew, if you look, my nephew's 16 years old, and before he was born, the map looks different. In 2008, the map changed. You had a new country, South Sudan. Literally, globe is different because people did little bits, connected to each other, had passion for it, and made a change. I mean, it's incredible what civil society can do.
Absolutely, and I've seen it a number of times. The invisible children in northern Uganda, some of you may have heard about that years ago, but there was this guy by the name of Joseph Kony that was going in the Lord's Resistance Army, and they were taking kids as child soldiers, and they operated a quarter of Uganda for a long period of time. It wasn't until these 3 college guys kind of got interested in it, went over, took some filming of it, started showing it at different college campuses. Some other college students got interested. Why is this going on? That there got to be a whole movement taking place. Got Joseph Kony thrown out, got the kids released, and he's not operating there anymore. There's 3 college guys. You can do this. You got to look at what's your heart, your passion move you to, and then move on it. And don't say I can't do it. Because I've seen too many times where people have been able to do things from very humble, simple beginnings, but they had a passion, they had a vision, and they saw something wrong that they wanted to make right.
Yeah, and the networks that you form, I mean, in one sense, you can't do anything, but in another sense, you can do everything, because you don't have to do everything. You do your bit. Yeah. Somebody else gets that vision. They do their bit. Senator Brownback does something. I do something. Somebody else does something. 15,000 other people do something. Then the President of the United States is actually paying attention to the issue. America's diplomatic might is involved, and the world changes. And so it can happen. And it happens all the time, and that's just one example. I also want to mention to the summit this summer, Chen Guangcheng, our distinguished fellow, and I spoke about religious persecution in China. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about that, because that situation, because the power and might of this Communist Party is such, and China is such a force in the world, that I think it must have implications beyond its own borders.
Huge implications, Bill. China concerns me more than any other country in the world on religious persecution today, by far, because they are the biggest enabler of human rights abuses in the world. They are beta testing the high-tech systems of religious oppression that they are using, and that they will probably give away freely to other countries willing to use them for authoritarian control. And those are the systems, and that's the place that's going to power it. China holds itself up as an equal model of how a country can be run to the Western democracy. They say this sort of collective, mercantilist, community rights, not human rights, is an equal model to ours in the West. And they're going to help support anybody that will come along their way, and they'll do it with money. We use resources too, but they're going to do whatever they can to buy it. And if they get control of enough places around the world with these sort of high-tech integrated religious oppression systems, it's going to be hard for people to break out of those things. Okay. And if they get their currency digitized, which is their next move, is to no longer, you wouldn't have any currency, it'll all be on your smartphone. Katie, bar the door then. Then if they don't like you, they can just turn your money off in a second, and you don't have anything. And they can track every single transaction then. This is really a dangerous moment for us to lose an ideological battle with such an oppressive regime that is so powerful and using its resources for that control.
And it's, equal opportunity oppressor. It oppresses all religions in China.
Yes, it's everybody. They really started on the Tibetan Buddhist. They went after them. And then they've gone hard on the Muslims lately. The Falun Gong, for whatever reason, they loathe that group, and they've just been so brutal to them. But they're going after the Christians now and everybody else.
So, they have an ideology to replace religion. So they want a kind of cult of the leader to replace any religion is bad in China. So they're determined to oppress it. So what can the U.S. do against a situation like that?
I think we need to call it out a lot more. And thankfully, the last administration, President Trump, and a lot of people may disagree with him on a number of things, is the first president to stand up to China. And he did. And he did it aggressively and kept him off balance. I think we've got to keep that up. I'm very pleased the Biden administration hasn't lifted a number of the sanctions that were put on and has added some. That's been very good. This needs to be a bipartisan confrontation with China, because they're at war with us whether we think we're at war with them. And I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party too. This isn't the people. I love the Chinese people. My youngest daughter's Chinese. They are wonderful people, but the party is out to displace and dislocate us and to run the world along their system. I think we need to call it out. And then one of the key models I would use, and most of you are too young to know this, but when the Soviet Union, one of the things that I think really cracked the wall around them was when the Jewish refuseniks, when they wouldn't let the Jews emigrate to Israel. And the world, there came a big shout around the world about, well, this is terrible that you won't even let your own people emigrate to Israel. And they were also doing this to evangelical Christians. They wouldn't let them out. But that showed a side to the Soviet Union of its persecution of its own people that was unsettling to the world. And it seemed just wrong. We need to do that same thing with China, saying what you're doing to your people of faith, to the Muslims, to the Buddhists, to Falun Gong, to the Christians, to everybody, is wrong. This is wrong. This is morally bankrupt. And it should be called out, and it should be called out specifically and widely.
Yeah, not to get too theological, but John Paul II, in his great encyclical Centesimus Annus, said that totalitarianism is based on an anthropological error about the human person. Essentially, the human person needs God and is ordered to God and oriented to God. And a government that tries to crush that is crushing the heart of a human being. So that's why we have to oppose totalitarianism, because it's built on an error about the truth of the human being.
Yeah, that's communism is officially atheistic. They just have trouble with religion, with any sort of allegiance to any other authority, and you're seeing that really being practiced aggressively in a way that we haven't seen it done before by the Chinese Communist Party. My concern is they've got a head of steam going, and they've got a lot of resources behind it, and they're very dedicated to it. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion we win this fight, is my point. And I openly wonder sometimes in the future, is the future of the world going to look more like Kansas, or is it going to look more like China? And what's taking place now? I think we've been asleep at the wheel here for some period of time. And I blame myself for it too, but I'm awake now, and it's not too late. But I just think we can't let this sort of ideology with that sort of technological capacity, that's the thing that's really different this time, the technological capacity to do what they're doing of oppression, to create a virtual police state, exist, and they're deploying it. It's being deployed. And once you get the currency done to where you can track every transaction, I'm not sure how a people fight out of that one. I don't know how you get out of that one.
And
it's almost like You get an early cancer, if you deal with it, you can deal with it. Once it gets ahead of steam and ahead of you, the odds become more 50-50.
Yeah, and in China, as I understand it, they're deploying 2.7 billion cameras in the next year. Think about that number. That's a real police state. And very sophisticated facial and body technology that can recognize who's who. They want to build a true totalitarian state with the power they have to export it. So again, I don't know, I guess you guys and gals all read 1984. We did in my generation. If you didn't read 1984, I mean, that's what's going on. And its enemy, enemy of the totalitarian state is religious faith. And, you know, as long as there's religious freedom, you won't have totalitarianism. But if you can snuff out religious freedom, you'll have totalitarianism. Do you agree? That's my thoughts.
I think you've really put your finger on it. Bob Destro, who teaches here, and some others have pointed out to me that, like in the civil rights movement in this country, Martin Luther King and organizing this, they all organized in the churches. You know, what if you don't have religious freedom here? Where do they organize? In Poland, and pushing back on the Soviet communism, it was the remnants of the Catholic Church that pushed back, and it was still in the hearts of the people. You know, you can push back if you have that. If you don't have that, it's one of the key assets that you're missing to organize something to push back against a totalitarian state.
Yes. Ambassador, if it's okay with you, I think actually we'll take some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Let's take some questions. I was going to have them passed in, but instead of going through all that, just raise your hand, and I can call on you. Anybody have a question?
Got a guy back here.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Sorry, I can't see you.
Hello, Father Francis. I'm a student here at CUA. I have a few questions. I don't know how many of them will be answered, but it's like about 6 of them. Is there any difference between freedom of worship and religious liberty, or freedom of religion? The second one is, any advice for priests here in the U.S. who may face persecution for upholding the teachings of the church in relation to extreme liberal agendas? You know, like some of the things we see.
Yeah, let's start with those first two, because those are both very good, and let's just do that. There is a difference between freedom of religion and freedom of worship. Freedom of religion, this is my definition of it, I don't know, I think most people look at it this way as well. Freedom of religion is your right to practice your faith in community or individually, in private or in public. So you get to take your faith with you wherever you go, including in the public square. And your values that you have, you can take there. Freedom of worship is that you have that right to worship within the confines of your own church. You can go into the church and you can worship there, but you can't take the values, and your values are limited to go out in the broader public space. So you can be a good Catholic, go to church, go to Mass, that's fine, but don't try to bring those values out in the public square, because the public square doesn't want those values by whoever's defining it. So in my estimation, what the founders were talking about clearly is freedom of religion, not freedom of worship. Because they believed in, we're not going to establish a church, you're not going to be a Church of America, and we're not going to limit you on what you can do with your religion. You got to practice it peacefully, that's it. The second one was on... What's that?
I think threat to religious people from, what'd you say, radical
liberalism? The second one is there any advice for priests here in the U.S. who may face persecution for upholding the teachings of the church due to the extreme liberal agendas?
Yeah, see, that's really probably the issue for particularly in the West on religious freedom, is that ability to take your values into the public square and to say, for me, I believe abortion is wrong. I'm opposed to abortion. I've spoken out, I've supported legislation, but there would be voices and forces trying to force people to say, no, you can't say that, you can't believe that, or on other agenda items. And I just say, and I don't want to get you in trouble, but I just think people ought to stand up for their faith. And be, I hope, winsome and loving and caring about it, but stand up for it and voice it. Because if you won't, as a religious leader, how do you expect your parishioners to? What do you expect them to do when a debate comes forward? And it's not going to be comfortable often. It's going to be difficult. But if you won't stand, and isn't that what Christians are supposed to be, is salt and light? You don't eat just salt. You don't just take a handful of salt and eat it. Salt's sprinkled in things and it seasons it. It's great that way. Well, that's what you just need to be, you just need to be the salt, and there may be consequences for you. Hopefully we as a country will stand up, and that's also why I stated here, I think we need something like a national committee for religious freedom in this country. Model it after the National Right to Life movement, where it's got a national head, but it's got state chapters. So there's Marylanders for religious freedom, Virginians for religious freedom, that fights at a grassroots level for religious freedom. Saying in our schools, we need to have religious freedom in our schools. That's a fundamental right. And I think we're just going to have to organize a lot more to stand up for religious freedom in this country and in the West in general, and to fight for it winsomely, and also to educate people of the beauty of religious freedom. This is a beautiful thing that we have this diverse society that isn't killing each other, hopefully most of the time, and most of the time it isn't, over any sort of religious difference. But people can bring their faith into the public square. And if you want to wear a skull cap, great, God bless you. If that's part of your faith, you want to be a Sikh and wear a turban, have at it. And what you stand for peacefully. But I think we're going to have to start fighting for it a lot more. And that's one of the things I'm pushing and organizing with people about, is that we need to organize a more of a grassroots push in this country to stand for religious freedom. We lose ground here, as I mentioned earlier, it'll hurt the whole world. It'll hurt us and it'll hurt the whole world.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a question on the situation in China. Seems that despite sanctions imposed on the CCP officials, persecutions continue in Xinjiang. So how would you comment on the situation? Is sanction working at all?
How would I repeat the last part of that again? It's about Xinjiang and then what? How
would you comment on the situation that despite the fact that CCP officials are sanctioned, persecutions continue on as usual?
Yeah, I think we've got to keep highlighting what's taking place in Xinjiang. I think we've got to keep pushing back. The prior administration declared it a genocide. This administration has said it is as well. What's taking place to the Uyghurs in China. I would hope we could rally more countries in the world behind our efforts to declare it that way. I would hope we would continue to sanction. And then also, I think we need to start using religious freedom as a marker in more of our foreign policy and defense discussions. In other words, I think we need to take a bigger place at the table on foreign policy that religious freedom needs to, so that whenever we're meeting with Chinese officials, we need to raise religious freedom. That has not historically been the case. We have raised cases with them at times in the past. The first time I met Xi Jinping, I was governor of Kansas at the time, and he was making his first trip kind of around the United States, and he was in Iowa, hosted by Terry Branstad, because he had been here as a student in Iowa, and I met him there and handed him a list of dissidents and people that he was persecuting, that they were persecuting in China, and I was saying, I hope these people get out. Well, I mean, as soon as they go to hand it to him, there's a guy intercepted it and took the list away. But we need to elevate this in our diplomatic areas, and I think we need to take these nascent movements, like we've got International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, these 30 countries, and really get some juice behind them and start elevating their stature like we do. This would be too big of a reach initially, but like a NATO, like an EU common market, where you know what NATO is and what it does. You know what the EU is a common market, and it does. We need to elevate that on this fundamental human right, really, and put some strength behind it. And that can be done. It's just we've not done it before on a human right. Build an alliance on a human right. And that needs to be done.
Why don't you say a word about these religious roundtables you were talking about that are being set up around the world, right?
Yeah. They've got about 30 different countries now with religious freedom roundtables, and what these are is all the various faith communities coming together in a single meeting area around the topic of religious freedom for everybody. This includes the majority and the minority, and if they're willing to, includes atheists and others that are willing to stand up for religious freedom. And what it is just, it's a powerful tool that instead of just the Christians standing up for themselves or the Muslims for themselves or the Buddhists, it's everybody saying, no, we have a fundamental human right that we need to be able to practice our faith and entitled to practice our faith. And we need to get those moving more and more. There's about 30 around the world. There needs to be more around the world. There needs to be more of them in the U.S. We could start setting them up in various major cities in the U.S., and they should be, to draw the grassroots awareness. And imagine what happens on a local media if in Kansas City you got the Christian community, Protestant, Catholic, LDS church, but you also got the Jewish community, Muslim local leader, Sikh, Hindu, all in a religious freedom roundtable, and the media is there, and they're all saying, you know, we need to stand up for religious freedom in our community. It would be a powerful statement because people don't expect these groups to get along. They don't expect them to even talk to each other. But now somehow they're not only talking to each other, they're actually doing plans together of how we're going to fight for each other's religious freedom here. Because we either stand together, we either all hang together or we hang separately. And we really need to get some of those started here.
What was your biggest challenge as an ambassador, would you say, as ambassador for international religious freedom?
Yeah, I got a lot of support taking place. Well, you know, this is going to be kind of hit close to home, but I pushed hard against the Vatican entering into agreement on the selection of bishops in China with the Chinese government, and we weren't successful. But I spent a lot of effort saying I think this is harmful to the church, but it's certainly harmful to the religious freedom movement in China. And that was one of my bigger disappointments, honestly.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So I kind of have two questions. I was wondering what your thoughts are on, I guess, Trudeau and his government's sort of relationship with the CCP and China in general. And I guess it seems that China is sort of mobilizing through Canada. I know where I'm from, like a couple hours from me, like there were Chinese soldiers who were sort of deployed for some sort of training. I know a couple friends who sort of saw some of the those things happening. And then as well, I was wondering, in your experience as ambassador, how did you, I guess, was there any sort of fruitful discussion around China with Canadian politicians?
With any politicians?
Canadian politicians, yeah.
The first one, I'm not up to speed enough on anything going on between Canada and China on an official or military basis, so I don't have any grounds to make any comments to you. I didn't have any particularly good discussions or useful discussions with the Canadian government on confrontation with China. Remember, when President Trump started taking on China, he was the first U.S. president and one of the first world leaders to take on the CCP, the Communist Party, in 20, 30 years. Most everybody in the world was just kind of getting kind of fat and happy off of China's becoming the world manufacturer and cheap goods coming out of China, and we were all living off of it, and everybody kind of thinking and hoping they'll change over time. They'll kind of modernize into an open, democratic type of system. And then they didn't. And then Xi took them on a hard turn back to full Mao communism. And so then it just, and then for a while even people were going, oh, that's just a phase they're going through. They're not really going to be that way. And then it got more and more. And so you go, no, okay, we got to take these guys on. This just isn't going. So we almost had to learn as a world again how to confront a communist dictatorship. We knew how to do it during the Soviet era, and we did it for a long period of time. But China, we just kind of, no, they'll grow out of this. Well, they haven't, and they aren't. The CCP isn't. And so, I mean, Trump was being critical of them, and it was hard finding Western countries to be critical of them because anytime you were, the Chinese were slapping you back heavy. Remember, they stopped the Norwegian salmon exports, and I knew because they threatened when we would sanction them on their goods that they were sending here. I knew the first place they would hit back would be places like my state and hit wheat, corn, soybeans, pork exports. So that's a big deal. Meat and agricultural exports are a big deal to my state. And you know this is coming. Because even though they export 10 times as much to us as we do to them, they know the sensitive pieces and they know we're a political system. And so you just got to prepare that, okay, this is going to happen. We'll find other markets, and did. But it's been hard to find other world leaders to confront China. The Muslim world has been particularly silent towards them. And I confronted a Muslim official about that, and he just basically said back to him, said, you know, the Chinese play rougher than you guys do. I said, oh, we got to play rougher. Is that the deal?
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all. And now we'll have a reception. Join me in thanking.